First of all, we're going to hear from Sherman Robinson, looking at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, sort of a structural simulation of 4 different countries. Then we're going to hear from Maureen Rimmer, who's using a quarterly CGE model to look at the impacts on the US economy. Then we'll hear from me, who's also going to talk about sort of the impacts of COVID on the US economy. And then finally, we'll hear from Adam Rose, who is going to talk about sort of a disaster framework that we can use for modelling COVID. So I think this is going to be a great session. We've got some good speakers, and who've done some really good work. I've heard most of them before, which is great. So shall we get started with Sherman first?
Okay, let me share screen, Microsoft PowerPoint. Okay, and you can see this. You can see the screen, I trust. The PowerPoint is really good.
Yes.
Basically, this is. Whoops. Wait a minute. Okay, basically, the pandemic hit, and everybody, a lot of us started working on it. I started working on it in South Africa with a group that you'll be hearing tomorrow. And basically, in this paper, I'm going to be looking at 2 approaches of how you look at this kind of a shock, a lockdown, instant recession, if you will. And I can compare 2 approaches of standard macro models and then multi-sectoral models. And we've been using this bottom-up approach in a number of countries we can talk about. We're going to be doing it in 4 countries, and here they are. It's just South Africa, Mexico, United Kingdom, and United States. Started with South Africa. You can see, get a sense of semi-industrial countries, nobody really poor, and then 2 advanced countries, United Kingdom, United States. Very different social welfare systems, very different ways of dealing with it. But it turns out the shocks turned out to be extremely similar across the countries. 2 different, what happened is you ended up with a basically household lockdown and industry lockdown in response to the pandemic. You closed non-essential businesses, very, very micro-focused. Both policies can be voluntary. People just scared to leave their houses, and firms closed down voluntarily because they couldn't manage their workplaces. You also then had them mandated by the government. So you had a mix of, not fully under government control. The 2 types of lockdowns were important to distinguish, but mostly they were complementary. It didn't really matter whether I was not willing to go to a restaurant because I was going to get sick, or the government closed down the restaurant. You get the same answer. It led to a catastrophic instant fall in demand and production in these contact-intensive industries. Very, very micro-focused, very special kinds of industries. And then you had knock-on impacts on other industries. In the US, for example, the automobile industry in North America simply closed down for the months of March and April because they couldn't run their factories, and you had no demand. Unprecedented speed. This was the fastest recession we've ever seen. So quarterly data really miss it. And even monthly averages were kind of understated. March, for example, it hit in the last half of March in the US, and you missed the first 2 weeks would be normal if you looked at the data. So the idea behind this analysis is to take a look at the shock and see what the economy is at the end of the time period we're looking at. In this case, we're going to look at months that's being delivered to the next. In many ways, this is like a national disaster. It is a bang shock on industries. It's just more widespread than lots of national disasters. The difference is, and I'm interested to hear from Adam later, the difference is you don't destroy the capital stock. You certainly stop using it, but you don't destroy it. So you had two. Okay, so we have we have two different kinds of recession. We have a hammer. Most recessions, and the way the macro guys think about it is, they all start at the macro level. Financial crises, bubbles, whatever, toxic financial instruments. And it then, real estate crash, it then trickles down to the rest of the economy and causes a demand, usually a big hit on investment, maybe trade, all kinds of problems like that. What that then does is, of course, at the micro level, changes risk perception, it causes a decline, nobody's willing to invest, you get all those kinds of problems. In this case, it's bottom up. We immediately hammered at the very micro level, and in contact intensive industries. It changed expectations. It also then fed back up and gave you elements of a standard recession as well. So you ended up with a double hit. First, a kind of disaster at the bottom, and then standard macro problems of nobody wanted to invest, international trade collapsed, consumer expectations got extremely changed, nobody was willing to buy a consumer durable, all of that. So standard models that work with these economic aggregates, what am I doing? This is very micro level, and we really wanted to work at the very micro level. And so what we did is, to model this, we want to work with disaggregated data. We really do need to come to do interdependence. So the correct answer in this environment is a social accounting matrix. And from this data, we get two families of models. We get computable general equilibrium models and SAM multiplier models. That's what and pretty much everybody that's doing this is doing it from a SAM-based system. The advantage of the SAMs is that we can work at a highly disaggregated level. So in the data I'm going to be presenting, we worked with a 184 sector model of the US, 120 or something for UK, something in the 150s of Mexico, and something hovering around 100 in South Africa. So we then chose to do a SAM multiplier model instead of a CGE model in here. And that's an interesting debate. The assumption of those models is fixed proportions in production, fixed proportions in demand, prices are fixed. So all adjustments in those models work through quantity adjustments, not prices. That is actually a very good description of what happened in March, April, and May, and June, even in these countries. And probably much better than trying to assume that somehow prices cleared to do the markets. So we've done we've done models of both. SAM multiplier models at IFPRI have been done for a bunch of countries. There's also about a literature on CGE models of doing it. My general sense of this is the CGE model, in order to make it work for this kind of analysis, you really have to torture it. It is not what is happening. We're not having market adjustments. Aaron Yeldon presented a very nice model in the previous session on Turkey, and you can see what he had to do to hammer that model to make it behave. You're going to get a couple more examples in this session, and it's doable. You can certainly force the CGE model to capture some of this. So, but we decided to go at, because we wanted to really get at the detail. We ended up seeing the lockdown shocks, industry lockdown, and macro shocks at the commodity level. And the way we did it is that we specified the lockdown shocks on a monthly basis. So we were actually modeling March, April, May, June. Once it started recovering, you could move into some sort of a quarterly model. And hit the shock at a very detailed level. So, as I said, 184 sectors in the US. That allows you to specify the shock based on very fine survey data. So you really could get it from the bottom up. So we hit it in the demand side. The way we did it is we looked at the three kinds of shocks: lockdown, household lockdown, industry lockdown, and macro shocks at this very detailed sectoral level, and then picked the biggest of the three as being the binding constraint when we modeled it. And that's in fact how we coded it. So here's what we got for GDP projections, and you can really see you really hammered these economies. South Africa got hit the worst. The U.S. not so bad, but still we're talking 15% cuts in GDP in a month in April. Mexico was everybody hit the worst month was April except Mexico, which kind of went down to May. The employment impacts are very similar across the countries. One advantage of using the SAM is we do have a fair amount of employment detail for these economies, and basically it did it what we're seeing in all the countries. It really hit the unskilled labor the worst, female labor when you dig into it, and major hits. So this is, you can see it again for the countries. Again, South Africa got hit the worst of all of these. You get a lot of change in sectoral production, and again, it was very similar across the four economies. So that was intriguing, and then we're finding that again from everybody else's studies. They were really hammering that. One interesting thing in this point, if you look down carefully, you'll see that the USA had the worst hit, had a negative hit on the health sector. Mexico actually had a big increase, which actually I think is a bit suspicious data. Why? That's very strange, because everybody else, you had basically national health systems. And it turns out a lot of health in the US is delivered by small doctor's offices. And for example, in the shock, dentist offices closed down completely for months. And the small doctor's offices were basically run like small businesses, and they had to either close down and then gradually move to telemedicine and such. Hospitals and such, that was the other side. But net, you actually saw a decrease in employment. And at the 184 sector, there's a sector called dentist offices. So we could capture that in this model. So then we looked at comparing, seeing if we can validate the models. And here is monthly GDP data for the US in blue, actual data, and then the model results for the shock in the first V-shaped recovery in red. What's intriguing is that when we did the shock, you can see it looked like it tracks extremely closely. It did not track the official data very well at all, which was intriguing. And then a colleague of mine at Peterson Institute looked at this, came up with this view of the GDP index that's better than this, and we really do capture this. Unemployment rate in the US, this was also interesting. Again, looked like we track extremely well for the shock. However, we actually didn't track the official unemployment data. Jason Furman at Harvard and Peterson Institute actually has produced corrected employment data for the US reflecting the state of the labor market. So, for example, in the US unemployment statistics, if you were furloughed, you were not counted as unemployment. You missed a lot of people leaving the labor force in the unemployment data. If you actually formally leave the labor force, you don't show up in the unemployment statistic that way. So once he corrected the data, it turned out we fit extremely closely. For UK, same thing. We had a very close fit to the GDP data. Mexico, not so well. We overestimated the beginning, the March shock compared to Mexico. And the people I've been working with in INEGI, the Mexican Statistic Office, thinks, in fact, that they think they badly underestimated in March because the lockdown prevented them from doing surveys. They couldn't do the kind of in-person surveys they were doing. They had to do them by phone, and that didn't work so well for Mexico. And then they kind of caught up and got the data better. So we tracked the period pretty quite well after that. For UK and Mexico, we could not get detailed employment data by the month. For example, the UK reports monthly employment data, but they report them as a 3-month moving average, which might as well be doing quarterly data for this purpose. So basically what we're observing is that the sectors that really got hammered were, no surprise, high shares of low-skilled labor. Countries that had the less generous social safety nets got hit worse. They didn't get support for them. And then South Africa is interesting among its developing countries, and you can hear more about it tomorrow. It has an extensive income support for poor households, not like European standards. Mexico is the worst of the 4 countries in this. Then we did have household income support in all these countries. We can use the SAM multiplier model to actually do a Keynesian multiplier analysis of that, which actually makes a lot of sense for this. You were injecting income at the bottom level, it got spent, and you ended up with an absolute true Keynesian multiplier. So again, fixed price operation here. We looked at that in all 4 countries. We computed the multipliers. We have a great deal of detail in the income distribution in these countries. We had deciles in 3 of them. We had income categories, about 10 of them for the US. So you could really focus the support on the affected people in this. Here are them, and then in a SAM multiplier, you can do the multiplier a couple different ways. One, you just do exogenous expenditure and household income is endogenous, and you get a kind of standard multiplier. Government transfers to households, that's what's the first column. If you can also allow a feedback effect in the SAM through savings and back into investment. So that gets you a somewhat higher multiplier because you get a second round effect that works through investment. And that's a kind of somewhat different multiplier analysis, but very standard in SAM analysis. We report them both here. In each case, the one that includes the investment feedback effect is higher. The numbers are interestingly comparable across. What happens is it depends very much on what the leakages are and the differences in the various economies. The investment link in this case is really, I think, not really makes any sense. Investment collapsed. So the SAM multiplier that uses the investment feedback, I think, is not plausible. But the actual household income multiplier, I actually think, is probably better than trying to do it in a CGE model. So as we move forward, recovery is going to involve a new and different economy. That's medium to long run. We can do something with the SAM multiplier models. Tomorrow we'll report on a South African model that does continue the SAM multiplier model past this into the first part of the recovery. But this is when I think CGE models clearly come into their own, and that's where we should be heading. I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Shannon.
Let me stop. How do I stop sharing?
I think if you hover over the the orange at the top, it'll allow.
There you go. I see. I'm sharing. Stop sharing. Very good.
Thank you, Shem.
It was covered.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a couple of questions. The first one's from Roberto Ronson. The SAM multipliers input-output modelling nicely accommodates demand-side shocks, but COVID-19 also generates supply-side shocks, example, lockdowns. I wonder how you accommodated, if you did, for these.
There is a literature in input-output models of imposing supply shocks as well as doing demand shocks. And the way that literature works is you have to then allocate the supply shocks across demand categories, and it's kind of arbitrary. It's not very satisfactory. In this case, though, we could get away with modeling the supply shock as an across-the-board shock in all demand categories because we're dealing with sectors for which there's very little intermediate demand. So the forward linkages of these hit sectors and the service sectors were just not significant enough. So we could get away with it in this case. Well, we'll hear from Adam later. He's actually done some work on mixed supply shocks, demand shocks in disaster analysis, where you are shocking intermediate inputs and things in the supply chain. Here, I think we successfully ducked that issue.
And from Sadnem Sahim, would you please repeat the 3 types of shocks you implemented?
You have a household demand shock. I will not go to the restaurants. I can't go to a grocery store. I have to do all kinds of complicated things. Second, the government mandates lockdowns. It closes non-essential industries and requires that. And then third, you actually have a macro shock as investors don't want to invest. Foreign trade collapses because this turns out to be a global pandemic. So you end up having some elements of a top-down macro shock as well as a bottom-up, very, very finely defined bottom-up micro shock. Both worked. They were tended to be complementary in the case of the lockdowns. Not completely. For example, nobody locked down the automobile industry, but the automobile industry locked down voluntarily. So it didn't matter whether it was mandatory or voluntary. You had the same effect.
Can I ask where you managed to get the sort of avoidance data for all the countries for the 3 months? Sort of this demand shock that you were talking about in the beginning with the not going to restaurants.
Yes, it was detailed industry surveys, our establishment surveys. The UK one was done through a lot of very good government data that we got hold of through a colleague at the London School of Economics. US is published. You can get at that data, and it's been used by the macro guys who really looked down, have dug into it. But we got it in very fine detail. I mean, 184 sectors turned out to be, we could get it somewhat finer than that. South Africa was harder, and you can hear about that tomorrow. And Mexico, very detailed. Again, INEGI collects, I don't know, they have input tables of 300 data, 300 sectors, and fine regional disaggregation. So, but they actually, again, were doing these surveys, establishment surveys.
Okay. And then I guess there's a next question. Is the paper available to read?
Yes, it's on the website. It's on, you can download it.
Yep, no, they're answering each other's questions, which is great. Okay. I think we've got a couple more minutes and then we'll, is that right, Alan?
Well, a couple more minutes. Let me make the point. There's a real debate with the macro people who really have trouble thinking about it as a bottom up. And you could argue, see some of the debate now on inflation in the US as you watch these very fine supply chains try to recover and causing price increases. It kind of seems okay to the macro people, but you ought to be able to analyze that in great detail. we can.
Great. Okay, let's move on to Maureen Rimmer, who's going to talk about using a CGE model to look at COVID, a dynamic CGE model. Okay. So do you want to?
Here we go.
Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And thank you. That was really enjoyable, Sherman. I like that a lot. I'm reporting today on work with colleagues at the Centre of Policy Studies. It was on a contract with Homeland Security that was conducted via the CAOE Centre of Excellence at Arizona State University. The contract started in March 2020 when COVID was a white-hot topic and there was little data available. All we had to go on were projections and scant information on lockdowns. Subsequently, we've been asked to do regular updates as data became available. So our first results were out in about May and then July, and then ever since then, our sponsors have wanted to see how the economy is actually evolving and going on into the future for 2 years. So today I'm reporting the effects of COVID on the US economy after 4 quarters of data. That's out to all of 2020, and this was work done in February 2021. Okay, so the aim of the project is to produce regular updates on the macroeconomy, on industries and regions. I'll just move that out of the way a bit. Yes, okay. We compare 2 runs of the model. The first is of the usage COVID model. There's a no COVID baseline, which is a run that shows how the economy is expected to evolve before the onset of COVID. So that was mainly using forecasts from the IMF, just a business as usual run. Then the COVID run, incorporating data up to February 2021 and projections reflecting the COVID environment. The 4 main features we used that were useful in usage COVID is firstly, it was quarterly. Now, according to Sherman, we should have done monthly, and I suspect he's right. Monthly would have been better. But we started the year in March of 2020, so we did get the full quarter in 1 quarter. So anyway, pandemics are all about sharp shocks over short periods, so we use quarterly. The other 2 features are a sticky wage adjustment, which allows for unemployment of labour, and a sticky adjustment of rental rates on capital, which allows for excess capacity. So let's talk about the first one. How did we turn our model into a quarterly model? Well, we did that by reinterpreting annual data on flow variables as annual rates of a flow in a given quarter. We reinterpreted values of start and end of period stocks rather than as start and end of year stocks as start and end of quarter shocks. And creating quarterly versions of adjustment parameters and flows in equations that connect start and end of year stocks. So that meant running around the model, dividing multipliers, dividing coefficients and certain stocks by flows by 4. And that produces a quarterly model. Now, what about the sticky wage adjustment? So this is a dynamic model, and just have a look at that equation there. We're just going to talk about the top line. If you do something really bad, like a pandemic on the economy, you're going to get employment to fall, that's the E, below the supply of labour. So employment falls relative to the supply of labour. Alpha is a positive parameter. And so just looking at the top lines, that means that the wage in a given quarter will fall below the lagged wage, the wage in the previous quarter. Now, the bottom lines are just the baseline, make it all relative to baseline. But when you use an equation like that, the kind of picture you get is the one below it. That's where if you do something really bad to the economy, down goes employment, and then wages start to fall, and that helps to bring employment back towards the labour supply. The third feature is the sticky rental adjustment, which gives excess capacity. Now, in what Sherman would term a typical CGE model, capital in use, that's the KU, equals capital in existence. So you've got the capital stock in a given year. So the supply curve for capital is just a vertical line below that KU equals KE. Now, if you do a big negative demand shock, so you move the demand from baseline right into perturbed solution, like a pandemic shock, if you're going with a traditional CGE model, you move straight down your supply curve to the perturbed solution at full capacity. And that means a large drop in rentals, but the capital stays fully used. Now, that's not what you see in a pandemic. Right? In a pandemic, you don't see that at all. So, and Sherman mentioned that. So what we do is we have this sticky adjustment on rentals, a bit like markup pricing, so that when the demand shift moves in, instead of moving straight down that vertical supply curve, the supply curve for capital in use is the green one. It's got a kink in it, and it doesn't, and the rentals hardly fall at all, but what you get is excess capacity. And then as the economy improves, you can move back out of this. So we wrote a paper, about Peter and I, about 15 years ago. You can't have a CGE model without excess capacity, and we still believe that. So that was incorporated into our modelling. And this is what it looks like. In the pandemic, these are deviations away from control over in these quarters from 2019 quarter 4 up to 2021 quarter 4. You can see that capital in existence falls a little bit because, you know, it's not great for investment, this pandemic. So you're going to get a slightly smaller capital in existence, but the capital in use really crashes and then recovers with demand as you come out of the recession. So, right, to do this analysis now, we need to have our no COVID baseline, and the no COVID baseline was a bland forecast based on data available in 2019 pre-COVID. The main inputs were an IMF forecast from the World Economic Outlook in 2019. Now, in the no-COVID baseline, employment grows at 0.24% per quarter or 0.9% a year for 8 quarters, starting the 1st of January 2020 and ending December 31, 2021. And GDP is growing by 0.47% per quarter or 1.9% a year. So that's a very bland baseline forecast. Now, when we first introduced shocks, there was a lot of courageous guesses about what we thought was going to happen to international trade and domestic travel, etc. International travel and domestic travel. We thought our projection was that there'd be an almost complete cessation of international travel between the first and second quarters of 2020. And to accommodate this shock that we gave the model, we endogenised consumer preferences against foreign vacations. We had an almost complete shutdown of domestic travel in the first quarter, and to accommodate that, we had an endogenous consumer preference shift against domestic vacation. We had a large negative reduction in investment. We had leftward shifts in demand curves for commodities and for exports. A very big leftward shift in demand for US education, exports of education. US is a good place to go to get your education, and it was very damaging to the foreign students who rock up in the US. And there was a 26% reduction in the average propensity to consume. So they were all kind of projections in early March of what we thought was going to happen. And we had 8% shutdown reductions in household spending in the first quarter on non-essentials, identified by Terry Walmsley, Adam Rose and Dan Way. So we thank We thank Terry, Adam and Dan for our lockdown shocks, which they generously shared with us. As well as these projections and sort of known shocks, we introduced the CARES Act with additional government purchases of $190 billion in the first 2 quarters and transfers from the government to households, which were $1.6 trillion. Okay, so that was in the early days, but I mainly want to concentrate on what we did after more data came in. So after the first year, our clients wanted us to go on with this and they said, well, look, you know what's happened now in 2020, so impose that on the model and what's going to happen next was their thoughts. So now we have to face the horrible truth of bringing in things that are a lot of published data. So we can't just make it up. We really have to use the data we're given now. So in the February of 2021, we had employment shocks at the 59 industry level for each of the 4 quarters in 2020. And we had output shocks at 56 industry level, but only for the first 3 quarters, because in February, the BEA had still not published their 4th quarter estimates. We had macro shocks, we had export shocks, we had visitors travelling shocks, we had saving shock to household disposable income, we had agricultural shocks and foreign student enrolments, and we had employment by state for 4 quarters. Now, as with the earlier simulation, the early hot days of the pandemic, the data are introduced mainly with endogenous shift variables. And one of the nice advantages about that is that not only are we hitting the model with actually what happened in that first year, but we also have the seeds of how to come out of it. Well, the way you come out of it is you exogenose those shift variables and gradually move them back to their baseline levels. So that's an easy, a convenient way to bring yourself out. You can vary that if you've got any special data, but we're going forward. So apart from bringing the shift variables out, we shocked GDP by 5%. Now that was our projection that in 2021 we expected the US to grow at about 5% year on year. And we backed out of that. What stimulus would be required to produce that result for GDP. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So first of all, why did we impose a 5% year-on-year growth in 2021? Well, there were 3 main reasons. Well, firstly, the strong growth in 2021 is physically feasible because of all the unemployed capital and labour. It can be brought back online. So it's not that hard to grow at 5% from that position. Strong growth is also fiscally feasible. When we imposed it and we endogenized benefits to be paid that would support consumption and get our GDP up to the 5%, we found that it was fiscally feasible. It will require a stimulus package of between 1 and 1.5 trillion, which was in the range of the current political discussions. Strong growth in 2021 is also consistent with a continuation of the V-shape that was very clear in the US data in 2020, the V-shaped recovery. So what were other forecasters saying? Well, here's a table with what people thought and when they thought it. You can see when we started in, say, April 2020, we thought the GDP in the first year would go down by 8.4% and then in the second year rise by 11%. World Bank thought it would go down negative 6% in June. But as you move down this table, you'll see from these main macro players that everyone's becoming more optimistic. In other words, we were all a bit too pessimistic in the early days. So why were the forecasters, why have they been becoming more optimistic? Well, Sherman talked a lot about this in his talk. In the early in 2020, forecasters anticipate a large sustained reduction in investment as was in the global financial crisis. And here's a picture of what happened to real gross private investment in the global financial crisis. That's over here on the left from about 2008.4 onwards. And I've just marked 2 years worth and the effect that had on GDP. And here's COVID over here on the right. It's a very sharp drop, as Sherman pointed that out, the sharpest ever, very sharp drop and short-lived. There's a V-shaped drop in investment and GDP and then rapid recovery. So what's going on there? Well, the global financial crisis is what Sherman was terming a macro crisis. It directly damaged the financial system that is responsible for connecting savers and investors, savers who are supplying capital funds and investors who want to use them. So after this has not been the case with COVID. It wasn't that kind of a recession at all. And after the initial hiccup, it appears that investors have taken the view that the COVID crisis will be resolved in 2021. And that's largely been the case in the US. So here we go. So main assumptions for the quarters beyond the data. So now we've taken on board that data. We've taken on the 5% growth for GDP in 2021. We've started to unwind a lot of our endogenous shifters and bring them back to their baseline levels. So this is how we did it. Yeah, okay. So we've got the general method of bringing the shifters back towards baseline. We've shocked GDP. The stimulus package was endogenous. It was sufficient to raise private consumption to a level necessary to achieve the assumed rate of growth in GDP. Usage indicates that the required package will be between 1.1 and 1.5 trillion, depending on the extent to which households increase their spending in response to the stimulus. When you pass benefits back mainly to consumers, how much of it are they going to spend? Investment in 2020 fell by less than would be expected on the basis of developments in the rest of the economy. I mean, year-on-year terms, it only fell by 5.3%. And through 2021, we assume that investor confidence will move back to normal levels. Employment data. So we had employment data up to the last quarter of 2020 and output data up to the third quarter of 2020. And we saw in that those two lots of data that they indicated that employment in many industries had not fully adjusted to the reduced output. For example, the airlines, their employment didn't go down anywhere near as much as their output did. So it's like they're hoarding labour. So there seems to be disequilibrium employment in some industries, and we eliminate those as we go forward, just gradually get rid of that. So the airline industries, you'd expect as they start to pick up, their employment will not pick up as fast as their output. Okay, going forward into the 2021, we're projecting still strong drops, the COVID will be a strong inhibitor to domestic and international tourism. For other foreign demand curves for US commodities, we project those to move back to control. And for US demand curves for imported commodities other than tourism, we expect those to move back towards control. And we projected public consumption to grow at its baseline value, which is pretty slow, 0.17% per quarter. So
Marie, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, I better hurry up. Okay, so this is a picture of GDP, what happened to GDP with COVID and without COVID, and the first 4 quarters are data, and we see it costs the US economy 8% of a year's GDP. For consumption, the cost was 11%, this is the employment, 11% of a year's employment, about 15 million one-year jobs. There's consumption, 8.2% fall, and there's capital in use, capital in existence with and without COVID. You see there's the idle capital costs the economy 5.4% of a year's capital rental. So running out of time, just briefly, this is a subset of our industries. The coloured line is where we're up to at the end of the data. The worst affected industries are the tourism industries and airlines. and hotels and restaurants aren't far behind. They're far behind, but they're adversely affected. And most of these industries are going to recover in 2021, with the exception of the tourism industries. On the states, two of the worst affected states are Hawaii and Nevada because they're heavily tourism related. So this is, in conclusion, COVID downturn will be mild relative to the GFC, and it will not be nearly as long-lived. I'll cut through those. I'll go to the last one. In making the forecast for 2021, we assume that the Biden administration will implement a stimulus package that's sufficient to generate 5% growth in GDP. The size of the required package depends on the reactions of households and other actors in the economy. If households adopt normal spending patterns, then the relative small package will be required, about $1 trillion. On the other hand, if households are cautious and adopt consumption propensities on the stimulus payments that's half normal income, then the package will require $1.5 trillion. And I better leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. That was wonderful. If I miss a question there, I'm not sure whether Galen Dev is maybe, I'm not sure if this is related to Sherman's previously, but are all the shocks demand side? Are there any supply side shocks? So preferences, there were a lot of preferences there, I remember.
It was pretty much nearly all demand side, a bit like Sherman said, like you can do shutdown by telling, by closing down a business. Like say restaurant meals, they're mainly consumed by households. So either you can close down the business or you can tell consumers they can't go, right? So, and it doesn't make a lot of difference to most of these shocks. So it's mainly demand side, but you see on the supply side, you've got excess capacity. So, but that will naturally, the economy will morph from being a Keynesian economy with as demand picks up to being a normal traditional CGE model.
Yep, that's great. So, Maureen, do you discern changes in the structure of the economy, example, consumption patterns going forward? Also, what are savings doing in the COVID simulation?
Well, yes. Okay, so let me get to that. I got my slides. Yes, there are some different patterns going forward. Households are still, even if they're allowed to, they're still reluctant to travel. So that there seems to be change in preferences and tourism-related things that are tourism-related activities, and that I think will continue for at least another 12 months or so, possibly 2 years. Some other challenges are going to be temporary. Like during the pandemic, we saw one industry that was doing particularly well was couriers. That's when we were all having parcels dropped at our front door. We were in Australia, and I presume you were in the US. There was a lot of home delivery as well, and shopping online. So there are changes in patterns that we think will continue. So not every demand shift do we move totally back to the baseline, because some might be genuine. We might believe that there are going to be genuine changes in preferences that will go on into the longer term.
Following up on that is so this is from Frank Van Tongeren. What are the savings doing in the COVID simulation? So it wasn't clear whether you were maybe, so there's changes in savings going forward. There might be a change in savings for pent up demand, sort of.
Yes. Yes. So the savings, we did change the savings. I'm just trying to find it. Yeah. We had a 26 going in April. We had a 26% reduction in average propensity consumes, therefore an increase in savings, and then later on the pent up demand was there, and so people were very slow, and that they went on a spending binge, and that lowered their savings. But yes,
That's great. Sounds like you've included different things. Sorry, Rob Davies, sorry for the long question. Static CG models have no time. No restoration of equilibrium takes some unspecified time. In an annual dynamic model, we typically assume equilibrium is achieved within 1 year. In a quarterly model, it is within the quarter? Is this not a problem? Surely in a quarterly model, there is some disequilibrium carried forward, which will affect behaviour in the next quarter.
Oh, no, we have disequilibrium. We have excess capacity. We have unemployment. So with our sticky wage equation that I put up earlier, so like employment, we have unemployment and the sticky wage adjustment, the way the dynamics of that works, if we were in an annual model, we tend to have that parameter I had, alpha, the adjustment parameter, we tend to have it so that if you do something good for the economy, you take it out in terms of more employment in the short run, so you get a spike in employment. And the adjustment parameter, like then wages will rise to drive that employment back to control, but not the next year. We typically set the alpha parameter so that it takes 5 years to get rid of that spike in employment. You can vary that if you like, but where we went to the quarterly model, and we made that period 20 periods rather than 5 years. So we do adjust the parameters of our model. We don't have it's not a full employment equilibrium model. We have unemployment, we have unemployed capital, and we have adjustment parameters. But when we move to quarterly, we alter those parameters. And if we move to monthly, which we probably should have in the first three months, we divide by 12 instead of by 4.
Okay. And Roberto Ronson, capital and labour markets are not the only markets in the system. You are still assuming equilibrium in those other markets, aren't you? Question mark.
Well, do you want to get on and ask me a bit more what you're getting at there? Oh, I can't speak. Okay.
Quickly, he's asking product markets clear. So product prices are exogenous.
Yeah. Well, the product prices, the way we've got our it set up is that the prices hardly move, which is a point Sherman made, because we're making the quantities adjust rather than the prices. So there's very little movement in the prices. And that's borne out by the national statistics that the price deflator for GDP hardly moves through all this mayhem.
Okay, that's the list of questions on the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's great. Yep. Just checking, it seemed to stop. So I will share mine, and since I'm the next speaker. Can I check that you can still hear me?
Yes, can.
Great, good, because that's where it went off last time, I think. Okay, whoops. I seem to have started in the middle. So in this paper, so this is based on a couple of different papers. We're basically looking at the impact on the US economy, but we're using the GTAP model, so we also have the rest of the world. And the project is sort of the result of a lot of different work by quite a few different people at USC, University of Southern California. It is work in progress. Our aim was to examine the economic impacts of the coronavirus over time, And initially we did a lot of this work in the comparative static model, and now we're slowly adapting it and updating it for the dynamic model. So what I'll do is I'll show you where we are with the dynamic model, but then I'll probably show you some old comparative static results for some of the latter simulations that we haven't quite got to yet. And the idea is basically that we build up the COVID from a comprehensive list of causal factors and actual data for 2020. So we're looking at the causal factors, and then at various points I've been trying to compare it to actual data to see how we're going. So we're using a global general equilibrium model based on GTAP. As I said, we use both dynamic and comparative static. So we started off with the comparative static model, and now I'll show you some results from the dynamics. Quite a few extra features in this model. We have supply chains, we have unemployment. I'm very grateful for going after Maureen because, very similar sorts of techniques that they use, I'm using as well. So we've got unemployment in both the labour markets and in the capital markets, and then that gradually reduces over time afterwards. The 50% is probably seems a little high. At the moment, we're just looking at what it's sort of as a comparison of what's actually happening in unemployment. So that may be reduced as we get more information. So provided wages are not rising. So if wages are still not rising, then there's no gradual reduction of unemployment. And then we also have quite a few additional preference variables and other taxes for tracking the closure and avoidance, etc. So we use the GTAP version 10A database, which has 141 countries, and aggregate that up into just USA, China, and rest of world. But we keep the goods and services completely disaggregated. And then our baseline is updated to 2020, and then from there we do semi-annual shocks from 2020 to 2023. So not quite as refined as either of the first two papers. We've stuck with semi-annual, partly because just getting the data, having the data available that we're trying to build up from was a little difficult to get on a month-by-month basis, because we're not actually spending a lot of time on the actual. We're spending more time on the surveys and things like that. So hence why I was interested in the survey information. We have a baseline, which basically includes a lot of the pre-COVID forecasts for some of the basic macroeconomic variables. So that's how we build up our baseline. So as I said, we kind of decompose it by the causal factors. So the idea is to actually look at sort of the mandatory closures and the gradual reopening process. Then we build in this decline in the workforce due to deaths, illnesses, having to look after your kids. And then we add on avoidance behaviour, increased demand for healthcare related, obviously, to the decline in the workforce because people are getting sick. And then we start looking at the recovery process, so things like fiscal policy and pent-up demand. And then we've also discovered some additional things that we need to think about, one of which Maureen talked about quite a bit, was the investment side and also the communications sector. So we found that there's some things going on in the communication sector. We're all on Zoom, so the communication sector required an increase as well, sort of a resilience way of getting out of this COVID, or lessening the impact. So in terms of sort of mandatory closures, we collect all the stay-at-home orders by states, opening schedules for the major states. We then collect extra data on telework and take that into account in terms of the closures. So something may have been closed, but there may have been a little bit of telework that could go on. We define non-essentials according to the US definition. So the stay-at-home orders are basically for non-essential products or production. And then the rest of the world and China, we look at their mandatory closures. We look at, so on Wikipedia, you can actually work out how many days each of the countries were closed or partly closed. And based on that, it suggests that the rest of the world, well, China was only really impacted in the first 6 months, and then the rest of the world seems to be still having some mandatory closures and deaths. So they're about, we're assuming they're about 6 months behind. In terms of modelling, so the mandatory closures are captured through the endogenous taxes in 2020 first period, that's semi-annual, which are basically slowly removed over time for reopenings and further mandatory closures. And then avoidance, we tend to put it in as a preference shifter. So they're pretty much, identical, as Maureen was saying. It doesn't matter whether you think about it from demand or supply. It's fairly similar. We looked at both productivity and taxes and found that the taxes seem to work a little better than the productivity. We also, in the mandatory closures, captured a little bit on the trade in services side by thinking about the fact that people couldn't move, so there were certain services trade in that wouldn't be able to be provided. So we did a little bit on that as well. In terms of goods, that all came out, that looked reasonable compared to when we compared it to actual, because you're getting things closing down. It was only the services that sort of needed a little bit extra in terms of closures. We assume that when consumers consume less because of the mandatory closures or the avoidance. So obviously, if consumers aren't consuming, then they're saving. So we also track savings during these mandatory closures. And then later, when we think about pent-up demand, we have an increase in savings. A decrease in savings, the savings comes back. And then we also assume some things about private demand for essentials. We keep health fairly constant in the beginning, so that we can, when we actually put in the health shocks, we can increase that. We have some avoidance of health as well, so we put that in later. Actually, I guess I should say it was impossible for us to actually get data on shutdowns of the healthcare sector. So we had a good look around, and there were lots of newspaper articles saying that the healthcare, they were sending people home, but when you actually looked at the data, it seemed like most of it was avoidance. So we didn't actually incorporate sort of a closure or a sending people home in the healthcare sector. We just incorporated that as avoidance. So these are the impacts over time. So as I said, semi-annual. So period 1 is the first 6 months. Period 2 is the second 6 months. We see fairly large declines, and then a gradual increase in real GDP over time as we start to recover. So this is just the mandatory closures. So we're closing them down, and then based on what we know about how the second period went, maybe mandatory closures weren't so fierce, and there were some reopenings. So GDP starts to, still decreasing, but starts to go up. Then we included the decline in the workforce. So we actually looked at sort of the impact of the deaths and the illnesses, and this came from the outcomes, looking at labour forces, the CDC, and we did some expert interviews, sort of working out, okay, these are the number of cases, these are the number of people going through hospitals. We didn't assume a skill bias on the deaths, so we just assumed that illnesses were pretty much the same regardless of what sort of skill level you were. And similarly for the rest of the world and China, we got that data from Ritchie et al. So some of the impacts of just sort of this decline in labour force due to deaths and illness, we find there was quite a big drop in the US these are fairly small numbers, though. You've actually got 0.14, so they're very small changes relative to baseline. But the US seems to have the largest drop initially, and then compared to the rest of the world, which is still going down. When we compare so far with actual, so this is pretty much where we've got with the dynamic model, and so the idea was to compare with actual. We see that we haven't quite got the same decline in the first period, and we believe a lot of this has to do with avoidance. So basically, that's the next step, is to look at this avoidance behaviour. So we've done a survey of avoidance through Prolific. We've captured 1,600 people, very representative in the US, and we've looked at sort of 10 avoidance domains: staying at home from work, keeping children home from school, cancellation of various appointments, or not going to spas and travel and so forth. So we've also got an idea of sort of in-person shopping versus going on the web and so forth. So from this, the idea is then to incorporate our avoidance behaviour on top of our mandatory closures. So these were the findings of the avoidance behaviour survey. So found that travel and transportation decreased 60 to 90% depending on the mode. There was definitely some medical appointments that were avoided. Dining, all the things that you're expecting, in-store shopping, but there was an increase in online shopping, indoor recreational activities. So these are, quite large avoidance that we're yet to incorporate. And if we have a look at sort of our sectoral production versus our actual, we're basically expecting, and we see that, so our simulation results aren't capturing the extent of avoidance. This is simulation results from the mandatory closures, and then this difference is basically due to what we think is avoidance. So once we put in the avoidance, we're hoping we should be able to get a lot closer. And then some of these other things, mining, for instance, are probably related to the avoidance of transportation and so forth. So it kind of gives you an idea of what's due to mandatory closures and what's due to avoidance. So, and then, as I said, there's these other factors that we're gradually taking into account. So we'll look at we've collected a lot of data on the healthcare expenses. So there's a lot of people sick, a lot of people using the healthcare. So on the one hand, people are avoiding. On the other hand, we will actually obviously increase health and see what happens to the healthcare sector when we increase the health based on illnesses and hospitalizations and so forth. And we're doing that for both, we do a lot of these for both China, the rest of the world, and the US, although the data tends to be collected from the US, and then using that, we base it give us some idea of what might be happening in the rest of the world. Other types of things, as I said, there's this rise in demand for communications that we think is important. And then the other thing that Maureen noted was this investment didn't quite fall to the extent we expected. And then as part of the recovery process, we'll be introducing this pent-up demand. So we have some sources for different pent-up demand that have happened in the past, and we'll use that. We also reduce the savings rate at the same time. And then we're also looking at the fiscal policy. So there's been basically 6 rounds of fiscal policy in the US, and about 5.1 trillion if you add them up. So these are the various 6 rounds. So we're treating the first 4 as one round. In our modelling, we'll look at the first 4, and then we'll look at 5 and 6, decompose the results to see, and you can see how much total spending comes to about 5.1 trillion. So the plan is to incorporate those. So as I said, we haven't done it in the dynamic model, but we did quite a bit of this in a comparative static model initially when it first came out. And these are the kinds of things, kind of results that we found. So I guess the first thing to note, as Maureen said, our mandatory closures, our assumptions were that these were going to be quite a bit bigger than they were. So what we're finding now is that the mandatory closures are quite a bit less than they were predicted to be initially. Perhaps avoidance might turn out to be a little bit more. We've got a lot more information on avoidance behaviour. Initially, when we did this, we were looking at typical avoidance, not avoidance that went on for months and months. We've all been staying home for a year. Our deaths and illnesses are pretty similar to what we saw above. Just probably better data. We've got a little bit of difference due to better data. Communication demand, that did have an impact. Healthcare expenditure was also positive. We didn't include the healthcare in the original avoidance, so we didn't actually have the decline in healthcare due to avoidance in this particular comparative static simulation. So that'll be something we'll be adding there. And then finally, pent-up demand. So you see sort of how it was decomposed in the early comparative static models. And then finally, just for fiscal policy, so sort of a comparative static analysis of the initial US fiscal policy showed that these rounds 1 through 4 actually could have quite a substantial impact on our results as well. So these were sort of preliminary simulations done on the fiscal policy. So it included some things like unemployment benefits, cash benefits to households, PPP loans and government spending, corporate taxes. So this is how we decomposed it. As I think Maureen was saying, it really does depend on how much of these things are saved. We assumed that unemployment benefits tended to be saved just at the normal rate in the US of about 8%. Whereas cash payments tended to be mostly saved. There's evidence that you have quite high savings rates on these cash payments. So that's the assumptions we made for that. So it's been an interesting way of thinking about it, trying to build it up from sort of the bottom up rather than putting in what we know. But I think we're getting there. It's a slow process. Thank you. Okay, what has happened? Oh, there you are. I'll stop sharing for a start. You don't want to see me getting completely lost. Okay. So questions for me? Please explain the endogenous taxes. Yeah, so we tried we tried looking at productivity, and the endogenous taxes is, so in order to hit those mandatory closures, basically we need something like a preference shifter or some sort of tax, an endogenous tax, and we ended up using an endogenous tax. The productivity, doing it from the supply side, was certainly we didn't find that to be very helpful at all. So the idea is basically we have the quantities going down by the amounts that it tells us from the mandatory closures, and in response we have an endogenous tax that causes that decline. So yeah, there'll be a little bit of associated tax revenue that's incorporated there as well, but we found that the taxes did less damage than a productivity shock, so I guess the other way of doing it would be to do preferences like what we did with the avoidance. So don't savings decline through income loss? Yes, they do. So we have a decline in savings through the income loss, but there's been an increase in the savings rate. So if you look at the data, the savings rate in the US, particularly in those first 6 months, actually jumped from like 8% up to 33%, and then now has come down to around 16% in the US. So that's the savings rate. But at the same time, income has come down, so actual savings in value terms has come down. So there's both of this happening at exactly the same time. Sherman, multiplier leakages are not just savings. Import propensities matter, and countries vary in the role of imports. Also, remittance, absolutely. So I guess yeah, we have. Well, we'll capture some of the imports. We probably don't capture the remittance behaviour in the other types of leakages, but we should be capturing some of these import intensities. And did you consider labour supply and capital stock shocks? No. So we have that unemployment. So basically, if we do it in a very similar way to what Maureen was talking about, where we are essentially in the initial periods, we have these sort of sticky wages, and then over time there's this response, and the employment is dissipated over time. But initially, especially in that first period, you're going to get a big decrease in unemployment. Our unemployment results didn't look too bad compared to actual. I think we do tend to have greater unemployment, but then I think there's avoidance of work, which tends to reduce the unemployment rates. And then there's also the fiscal policy. So we haven't yet put in the fiscal policy, which would probably cause more people to become to stay in employment. So we're slowly looking at that. Does GTAP model have subsistence level? So it doesn't have subsistence level. It doesn't have a subsistence level of essential consumption, and that's why initially the assumption was that and I think I said it right at the beginning, we have in the modelling we have an assumption that people are going to buy certain essentials. So we actually fixed consumption of essential commodities, private household consumption of essential commodities. So that was trying to capture this idea that there was some sort of subsistence level of consumption. But we didn't shock it, we just fixed it. So Sherman, notice that the assumption of sticky wages and rental rates effectively limits changes in prices, and the CG model behaves like a fix. Absolutely. Then the shock to demand, as in the multiplier model. Yes, I agree. So as I think we've discussed before, in these models, we are, especially in that first couple of periods, we are tying it right down, and it's almost working like a fixed multiplier model. Agreed. Ooh. Okay. Do we have is our colleague here? Adam Rose, is Adam Rose here?
I don't see him on participant list.
Okay.
Well, we are ahead of schedule, so
We
you
are.
can continue the discussion. Frank Van Tongeren writes, yes, Uncle Sam is alive. Yeah, I just a quick comment. What Maureen and Terry are both describing is you are shocking the model by just hammering the demand side. Maureen called them endogenous shifters, but what she really meant is she's shifting demand to calibrate the model properly. Then you do have the going forward, then what you can do is say, okay, we go back to normal, we'll move those shifters back, and we can do it over time, and that's very interesting. I think that's actually an important part. In the multiplier approach, we're turning out to be doing exactly the same thing. We use the multiplier model in South Africa to create a shocked SAM to start a forward-looking CGE model. And then the goal is exactly what you're doing, would be then to do all the shifters to be back onto a normal SAM or a projected SAM. So you're playing the same kind of game, and it both work.
Yeah, okay, but we're playing it in a way that sort of we shift seamlessly from a Keynesian model to a classic CGE model as demand conditions change. So the beauty of it is that you don't have to touch it, and different industries are coming back to full capacity at different times, depending on what's happening in the prior shocks. So it's a seamless thing. It's not choosing one or the other. It's having both, having a Keynesian model when you're stuck with this great big recession, and then coming out under stream into a totally normal CGE model later. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and we kind of haven't had to torture the model. It works a treat.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things we've all found, everybody doing this, is that when we hammer it from the bottom up, we do very well calibrating to the actual events in these countries. I mean, I think that seems to be, and very similarly across countries, which is quite intriguing, and not something you could do with a DSGE model or a standard macro model. They can't do that.
Yeah.
If I may ask, I mean, and I have a comment. My comment is, I think that many of us are torturing our models to try to predict today somehow, so the COVID thing, which is okay, I think, because whether it's a fixed price model or a CGE with flexible or limited price movements, the main thing is we have a consistency framework that gives us the way to think about this crisis, I think. I had a question for Sherman, and that's about your SAMs. The question is whether you are able to say something or you have sufficient detail on the household side to disaggregate impacts by household types and income groups and what have you. Because it seems that there's a lot of concern going forward about distributional effects in particular of this crisis. And the SAM in principle would be good at that.
Yeah.
In the US case, we used data coming out of the implant model and disaggregated households by income ranges, and to about, I forget now, 12 or so. UK, we had deciles for incomes, for households. Mexico had something like deciles. Oh no, Mexico had a great deal of detail in by households categorized by gender and of the head of the household and skilled categories of workers. So you had a fair amount of detail that kind of gave you a pretty good job of linking it to the labor markets. And South Africa was again deciles with a more finer breakdown of the top decile. So you have a fair amount of detail to focus the multiplier analysis, what I keep calling the multiplier analysis, and same thing with Maureen and Terry, where you can, when you do the fiscal shock, you can aim it quite tightly into these households by the distribution. And that makes a difference because the multipliers, you just look at the SAM multipliers, which are going to be exactly the same as the CGE multipliers that both Terry and Maureen are going to get. Are very sensitive to the distribution of income. It also turned out to be, in our case, very somewhat sensitive to trade. I mean, UK had much lower multipliers because it all went into imports. And then in some parts of the US, remittances did matter at those lower household levels. When we looked at California and Los Angeles, remittances were a big deal. So yeah, but that would be also true of the CGE. The CGE model would also do as well as do in the SAM multiplier. They're going to be the difference. The only advantage of the pure SAM multiplier is you can go down to 500 sectors if you want to. There was work done. Terry could tell you about that work doing in LA and California at very fine levels. We aggregated up to about 184, which gave us a lot of fine detail. I would not want to be messing with a CGE model at that level. But
Well,
you can
we
get the
have
basic story.
our usage model has 400 industries, so
Yep,
we get.
yep.
But I didn't run this on that. I ran a bit over 100.
Yep. And you're using that same input-output table that we used, the BEA, big BEA table.
That's right.
So we have a question for Maureen. Can you shop capital stock and supply with fixed rental and wages in a static case and fixed shifters? Would you get similar results?
Well, I don't think I'd want to do that, actually. It's a long time since I've done anything static. And no, I don't think I want to do that. I think the dynamic's the way to go. So you know, it's quite clear in these pandemics, you're not going to be running at full capacity. You can see, well, lockdown, for goodness sake, you know, they're closed down. But you know, like, yes. So the rentals do tend to stay fixed, and capital goes offline. But I don't know why I'd want to do that in a static case. I mean, most clients want to see what's going to happen in your model from today, year on year or quarter on quarter out to the future. What's the short run effects? What's the long run effects? So.
No, but I think the way the question's going is you could, if you actually had data on capacity utilization, you could use the rental rate and the wage in reverse as an estimation process to make the model track actual data. If you had it.
So you mean if you only had a static model or something like that? Yeah. Okay. All right.
I have a question. I'm not sure if that's okay to jump in quickly.
I don't see why not.
Thank you.
We got plenty of time.
No, I started typing it, but it was too much to explain, to be honest. So we've been working with Dominic also on and Maxim on tracking the COVID shocks, in the global dynamic model. And what we found was that it was very hard to endogenously get the oil prices to behave in the way they behaved in 2020. So just if you have a shock to demand and however you model it, we couldn't get a decline in oil prices, so endogenously. So we had to play with changes in demand for transport and so on. And in the end, I think we ended up treating them as exogenous shock just to follow the path of 2020, 2021. I'm just curious, what have you done about the oil prices, whether they were exogenous or endogenous in your application? Thank you. And that's a question to all presenters or whoever feels like responding to that. Thank you.
Well, the oil prices for me are naturally endogenous. What about you, Sherman? I mean, I've got the import prices not moving very much. No prices were moving very much. So.
What we did was very fine analysis of the complete collapse in transport demand. Nobody drove their car, and nobody was buying a car. So that caused a dramatic. There's Adam coming in. That caused a dramatic decline in the demand for gasoline. We did not track, but of course, it's in the single country fixed price model. We didn't look at world prices at all.
In aviation.
So
aviation
aviation would be the other one. Yes, globally.
Yeah. The big loser was the airlines and the tourism industries for us, the aviation, and no airline fuel. I think Adam's right.
So in our particular model, so we noticed that. So when I compare the actual values to the simulated values, mining, which is essentially the oil, because it's aggregated to the US categories, definitely declined a lot more than the rest of them. And I guess my thought was exactly what Sherman and Maureen are talking about, is that once I capture the avoidance, that mining will hopefully go where it's supposed to go. But maybe you're telling us that it won't be enough. So maybe a space to watch. But yeah, it was something that I kind of went, that's a pretty big. It was a pretty big decline over and above what the model was giving us. But yeah, I've still got avoidance of transportation, avoidance of, so that was the hope. But yeah, so thanks for the heads up. I think maybe 1 or 2 minutes while Adam, maybe you can share your screen.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you.
While you share your screen, I will, I think there might be another question for Sherman, so I'll ask that one. So Sherman, yeah, it is Sherman. In an IO multiplier model, I shocked the sectoral production to get changes in the exogenous demand shock, like exports, household consumption, investment. Would you agree with the approach?
I'm not sure what you mean. When you do a supply shock in the input-output model, you have to allocate the shock down the row of demand, and where it's a big deal is in the intermediate demand. When there is very little intermediate demand where we were working at, I don't think it matters. What you sound like you did is shock the demand side, and as we've all been finding, that pretty much does the job. Am I missing something in the question?
It says I shocked the sectoral production to get changes in exogenous demand.
It sounds like you're trying to tune it on the demand side to hit a target production decline, and sure, you are faced with the question of what happened to the composition of demand, and if there's a lot of intermediate demand, you have problems. Adam can tell you about that.
He said, so it's Galindev, and he said, yes, sorry, you are right. Basically, I tried to find the demand shocks, exactly the composition of the shocks. Okay. So, Adam, are you?
Yeah, I'm having trouble with, tell me, yeah, you can see me, but can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Can you see my, you can see my, but can you see my PowerPoint?
No, we see your Purdue, we see Purdue University, the session, join meeting. So maybe it's on the screen, or bring it to the top.
So help me for a minute. Yeah, this is a different screen share. Yeah. So let's see, Zoom meeting. I don't want to do Zoom meetings. Let me get rid of some stuff on my desktop.
So if you're in share button on the bottom.
Right, I was. Let's see, start, share, start. Now, Terry, I just sent you my PowerPoint, and I'm thinking if I can't get this in a minute, I may ask you to do my slides if you check your email. Okay, so I got the share. You're sharing. Start. You're sharing. Start. Meeting recording is in process. You're sharing. Start. This is different than any system I've seen. Terry, do you have did my slides come through to you?
Not just yet. I've been having problem with my.
Okay, plan B. All right, you're sharing. Pause, share. All right. Oh, boy. Share content. And why people are viewing start. What do you just see the GTAP thing, huh? All right. My apologies. You know, I tried things out, but I didn't try the screen share. All right. All right. We're doing a little better now. All right. Now, how about this?
I've got a black screen.
You've got a black screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, because I've got my PowerPoint on.
Okay. Well.
What do you black screen still? You're sharing still a black screen. Let's see, Terry, have you got my PowerPoint? I guess that's the question. Otherwise, I can send it to Maureen or Sherman.
I think you might have to, because I'm struggling with my email.
All right.
I'm trying.
Oh, you're sharing share. Oh, okay. Let's see. I got screen one. That do it?
No.
No. All right. Meeting. Stop sharing your screen. All right. So everybody,
I can see your things.
You can see the screen?
Adam. Yeah.
See them too. Yeah, I can see them, Adam. They're there.
Oh, you can too. So Terry, you got to get a new computer. That's all there is to it.
It's coming. Yep, it's here.
It's here now.
You're on.
Okay. I'm on now. I'm going to put this. How about that?
Yep.
Okay. Success. So first of all, thank you for accommodating me. I belong to a strange religious cult, and it's against my religion to get up at 5 a.m. So thank you for letting me adhere to my basic principles. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors, and I'm getting a lot of Terry. You may want to put yourself on mute, because I'm getting your clicks on your computer as you're typing. So, Terry, can you put yourself on mute? Okay. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors. You all know Terry, Richard Johnson, the psychology department at USC. Jakub Lofka is in public health. Dan Way, my long-standing colleague, former student, in the Price School, and Katie Bird also in psychology. We're all associated with the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. Ominous sounding title, but we are really an all-hazard center. In fact, we're about to change our name to the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Threats and Emergencies to get that across. Remind me, how much time do I have?
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
I
Okay.
give you 2 minutes warning on 18 minutes.
Good. Okay, good. All right. So recent major economic downturns like the 2001 dot-com bubble and the Great Recession were primarily caused by financial or real estate imbalances or bubbles. And most analyses of COVID-19, except for this group, tend to use conventional macro or financial models or variables. But my analysis of this early on was that COVID was much closer to ordinary disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes than these other sort of financially caused downturns. So over the years, I've helped contribute to a field we now call economic consequence analysis. And the purpose today is to present a framework for analyzing disasters with special attention to COVID within that domain. And essentially, this field advances ordinary impact analysis that's been around for 50, 60 years and does it in a CGE context appropriately. But my point to people using macroeconometric models out there, this framework can also be adapted to those kinds of models as well. So I got my start in this almost 15 years ago, looking at terrorism and disasters by looking at a group of bioterrorism attacks and their likely impacts on gross output in this case in the U.S. economy. And you'll see over here on the right-hand side, if you can see the cursors, total gross output impacts of an attack on a stadium or an urban center or an airport or used foot and mouth disease, all yielded approximately the same total gross output hits, but they vary significantly. A stadium, you've got a concentrated large number of people, so what's going to dominate is a loss of life. The ordinary business interruption from just that stadium out of business is fairly small, but they're likely to close a lot of stadiums, or people are going to avoid going to stadiums, and so you have this behavioral linkage effect. On the other hand, resilience refers to the fact that people aren't just going to put their money under a mattress, they're going to substitute other goods. And you can go through similar analysis for an urban center. The airport is associated with some findings from my study of the World Trade Center attacks, where the largest effect by far was the almost 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism that dominates. And the foot and mouth disease, there the behavioral linkage is primarily other countries using it as an excuse to ban U.S. exports. Resilience in terms of airports is pretty high because of substitution possibilities. There are other travel modes. So this all comes together in what I call the Create Economic Consequence Analysis framework. And you start with the disaster event scenario, and it has impacts in terms of loss of life, direct economic impacts, either property damage or business interruption, meaning impacts on output and hence GDP, and in some cases remediation costs that we can factor in. So that's pretty much the way ordinary economic impact analysis works, and you have some macro or economy-wide model that generates the effects on all sectors, whether it's IO or social accounting matrix or CGE model. And again, what we've added, and this gives you the total economic impacts, what we've added are resilience adjustments, which should relate to the entirety of these direct impacts, not necessarily loss of life, but direct economic impacts. And it's basically, I'll mention in a moment a clearer definition, but adjustments after the disaster strikes to keep operating as well as you can. And the other is behavioral linkages, which also work in the opposite direction and tend to exacerbate the losses. And so this is the comprehensive framework. We've also, just not on the consequences side alone, but factored in mitigation costs, and more recently, the spillover effects from those mitigation costs, such as having countermeasures, bag and parcel checks at stadiums, and other kinds of screening, which might turn people off to where they would no longer attend these events because they're put out by the countermeasures. So that's the overall comprehensive framework. To get down to cases in terms of defining economic resilience, I've been studying resilience for 25 years before it was cool. And I've studied it in a dozen disciplines, and those are planning, engineering, economics, ecology, and etc. And actually, I found more commonalities than differences. And what I present below is a general definition of the concept of economic resilience in static and dynamic contexts, and then an economic adaptation. So, general definition of resilience is the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked. Not things you do before the event, that there's a perfectly good word for them, and that's mitigation, but the ability of a system to rebound, really. And this is consistent with Buzz Holling's definition of resilience, who is really considered the father of modern resilience analysis in the ecology realm, but we're adapting that definition. And the economics specific definition is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. And so the efficient use being injected into this goes to the heart of economics, which is the science of scarcity. And so resources are scarce to begin with, and even more so when you have a disaster of some kind. The dynamic definition, which I'm not getting into today, relates to the ability and speed of a system to recover, and it's all about the efficient use of resources for investment, as you can imagine, being a dynamic concept. From this, I came up with an operational metric for resilience 15 years ago and challenged other people to come up with something better, but it's a pretty basic metric that seems to work in a lot of contexts, and it's basically the prevented losses as a percentage of the maximum potential losses in the absence of resilience. And let me give you an illustration of this in the case of 9/11. So 95% of the 1,100 World Trade Center area businesses and government agencies relocated after 9/11. So if all of those firms in the trade center would have gone out of business, the direct business interruption loss would have been $58.4 billion. This is in about 2007 dollars. If all relocation were immediate, though, the business interruption would have been zero. So while so many businesses did relocate, it took 2 to 4 months to do so, and there was some business interruption, from our survey, equal to 16.1 billion. So the avoided losses then are essentially 58.4 minus 16.1, or the 42.3 billion, and the maximum potential losses, had all of them gone out of business, would have been 58.4 billion, and the ratio is 72%. So we can say that 72% of the losses, potential losses from the World Trade Center attacks, were prevented by business relocation alone, which was essentially the dominant form of resilience. Okay, my screen has frozen. Terry, did my just let me see what I can do.
If you click on the screen, it might have gone away. Just click on the screen and then try moving.
Oh, click on the screen. Sorry. Oh, all right. Thank you. So that's resilience. As far as behavioral linkages, they're primarily off-site responses associated with behavioral changes. And, we can think of the site being a person's home, and in this case, an off-site being anywhere out of the home that people are afraid to go. And it typically emanates from social amplification of risk and stigma effects through media coverage, rumor, notoriety. And essentially fear feeds on itself and spreads, and this can translate in direct and indirect business interruption losses on the order of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude higher than the original loss that is incurred. It turns out, I mentioned one of the factors affecting the bottom line in 9/11. The irony is that the largest remaining negative hit on the U.S. economy due to 9/11, after you factor out, the direct business interruption, was the almost 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism. People were afraid to get on a plane. If we look at other terrorist attacks or regular disasters, we often have workers afraid of riding the bus or subway after a terrorist attack on those. Businesses fearful of staying open after dark. If you have a terrorist attack or power outage, people afraid to return to buildings after an earthquake, especially in developing countries. So in COVID-19, this pretty much leads to fear of personal contact with the outside or fear of contaminated locations such as hospitals, and avoiding those at all possible. And just one little aside, I've made a distinction in my research between avoidance behavior, which I'm going to talk about today, and aversion behavior. So avoidance behavior is sort of an outright cessation of demand. It may be a truncation. You may demand a little of a good, like you only eat swordfish once a month because you're afraid of mercury, but that's it. Otherwise, you avoid it. But it's not price sensitive. Aversion behavior, which we haven't factored in, and I think is less relevant, is where there's a customer discount or something that may attract people. And I've did some work with James K. Sickey at then Monash and now at Victoria University in a paper in 2012, and the references to this that shows how aversion behavior can be incorporated into a CG model with a dirty bomb attack. But primarily here we're talking about avoidance. So with all of this said, if I enumerated the causal factors related to COVID when we started this study that Terry has presented to you. And these are the factors, and I don't have to go through all of them, but essentially practically every one of them, except for the workforce declines due to health issues, people dying or being sick outright, are either behavioral linkage or a type of resilience. So we start with mandatory closures. One could say that's sort of a government behavioral reaction, the reopenings, the people slow and hesitant to come back out, down to pent-up demand, which is a type of rebounding when people spend at a later date. I now have the honor of presenting some results from one of my colleagues, Richard Shawn, who just completed with Katie Bird a very valuable survey where they surveyed 1,600 people to gauge their avoidance behavior. And they looked at 10 domains, everything from staying home from work to keeping children home from school, which then means somebody's got to stay home from work. And again, you can read these yourself, but they're the obvious: avoiding in-person shopping. And then the resilience part is e-commerce. Keeping children, staying home from work, well, the resilience response, neither of these totally compensate, but they compensate a good deal, is telework. Some of the findings you'll find on this side in terms of really, the survey response: travel and transportation decreased by 16 to 90% depending on the mode. Dining out decreased by 60-80%, but then you've got the drive-through dining or resilience. The same thing with this suggests that online shopping came pretty close to totally offsetting regular shopping, and the others. So as far as resilience, drilling down, I mentioned one resilience tactic, and that's relocation. But what I've done over the years is identified another 10 tactics, most of them self-explanatory, practically all of them relating to an input disruption, not having a critical good available. And in this case, it's often a business not having its employees be able to come to the site. And one can think of telework as a type of relocation effort. But you can see the others in some simple definitions of these. And we've linked our various resilience tactics to the model, as Terry explained, and basically fit into these categories. And the categories have a broader application if we're talking about a oil embargo or an embargo or some disruption of some other critical input, or a massive input as when you've got a port shutdown. So we've done survey research in the last 3 years with my colleague Noah Dormady at Ohio State, former student too, of Hurricane Harvey victims and Superstorm Sandy victims. And we have this benefit cost ratio here to exhibit, and it shows essentially an inverse cost effectiveness ratio that resilience tactics yield benefits over 3 to 1 for some of the tactics, meaning the losses prevented are 3 times as great as the costs incurred. So one thing that the 9/11 study didn't do is put the cost in the denominator. It just looked at a 72% recovery to prevention, but didn't factor in the costs of the relocation, which would have probably offset or the gains a little bit. But here, this is the full benefit cost ratio analysis that we've done. So I guess, okay, I'm right on time. So just to conclude, economic consequence analysis provides a comprehensive framework for analyzing COVID-19 and other disasters. The most relevant aspects of the framework, aside from sort of the ordinary direct, figuring out what the ordinary direct demand loss is and the economy-wide effects, are resilience and behavioral responses. You know, resilience is often thought of as a fuzzy buzzword, but analysts in this field have really been able to clearly define it. And as I mentioned before, and showed you an example, we do have operational metrics for it that are quantifiable, and readily so in the case of COVID-19. And I haven't got into details, but some of the studies I've cited show how you can incorporate these resilience and behavioral response factors readily into CGE models through parametric changes or adjustments in their constraints. And finally, I guess these will be posted. These are some of the publications that are relevant. For example, the latest survey of Hurricane Harvey victims is this first one, this paper with James Gaisicki, when he was a postdoc with us at CREATE, is here in risk analysis, an earlier study of influenza, and also refer you to one with Peter and Maureen on H1N1, published about 10 years ago, and some work on resilience, work on a book on a computerized version of the economic consequence analysis tool. We also have Noah and I have a business resilience calculator, a decision support software tool here, and the 2 studies published so far with Terry as the lead in applied economics letters, and more recently in economics of disasters and climate change. So thank you very much. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, Adam. That's great.
Sure.
Any questions, either in the chat or? Wow, just a minute. Here we are. They're popping out as I'm going. So in your studies, do you also...
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sabnem Sahim, in your studies, do you also account for avoided deaths and injuries?
That's actually an excellent point. And the irony is I just wrote a paper comparing COVID-19 with other disasters, and you know the last 20 years, and even if you go back farther, there's no natural disaster that incurred more than $100 billion worth of GDP losses. The one exception might be Katrina by just a bit because it took so long to recover. And in today's dollars, 9/11's on the order of 200 billion. And here you have COVID-19 with estimates that Terry showed you. I don't know, the latest may be a little different, but the latest published numbers for us were 3 to 5 trillion. And so you have this enormous disparity, but the disparity is even larger on the death side because as I don't have the number quite in front of me, but from 9/11, I think the loss of life would be estimated in dollar terms as 30 billion, but it's more than 6 trillion using a $10 million value statistical life. So it's like 200 times as large. So the GDP impacts don't necessarily do justice to the loss of life.
Oops. We can't hear you, Adam. Something's happened. Can anyone else hear him, or is it just me?
Nope, can't hear him. Adam, stop sharing your screen. That may help.
That may help, yep. Maybe you've also pressed something on your headset by accident.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm glad you guys have all the fixes. So a vaccination would be mitigation, and life-saving at a hospital, one might be able to think of as resilience. But I haven't thought that through. But clearly, if you go back to that number I just gave you, the loss of life in this case is larger than the general equilibrium impacts on the economy. So it is an important area that we ought to look at in some way, probably off to the side, because you're comparing apples and oranges if you're comparing deaths to GDP losses.
Okay. We're running out of time. There's a couple more questions from Frank. Right. Is it possible to say something about the persistence of avoidance behavior over time so as to get an idea of the long run impacts?
That's an important point too. The survey I just mentioned compared, let's say a November time period to a 6-month period thereafter, and so we'd have to do surveys after that. But one of the things we found in terms of avoidance in general is that it really goes up and it really tracks with media attention in ordinary disasters. So let me get at this in a roundabout way. Through this social amplification of risk consideration, and it gets a lot of media attention and people get real scared, and then the media attention drops off because they go on to something else in a lot of cases. But there's a lag in actual behavioral responses. They don't dissipate quite as long. At the same time, there are stigma effects that can last many years, as in toxic waste sites, or possibly a hospital or nursing home that had a terrible record for COVID. So avoidance behavior is going to dissipate. We just don't know. Typically, we just don't know how quickly, unless we do some kind of empirical analysis. I think surveys are the best, but I'm working with some people on a NASA grant where they're using remote sensing data to track, instead of asking people, using remote sensing data at shopping centers, et cetera, to gauge whether people are returning back to storefronts.
Ala, are we good for one more question, I think? Or...
Yes, I just changed the background. Yeah, we're good.
Okay. There is a lot of, from Rob Davies, there is a lot of talk about using the pandemic to build back better. Would it be fair to say the greater the resilience, the harder the better will be?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting dimension of resilience that I didn't get into, and it deals a little more with the dynamic. The static is using the resources you have at a given point in time to produce as much as you can. When you get into the dynamics, and interestingly, another paper I wrote a couple of years ago with some colleagues in China on the Wenchuan earthquake showed that it's not reducing the time to recovery that has the greatest effect in reducing losses. It's actually accelerating or kickstarting the recovery that gives you the biggest bang for your buck overall. And so, there are multi-dimensions of the dynamic resilience. So one of them is that dynamic resilience should also be about not just replacing the capital. And Terry, again, I think or somebody is typing, so put yourself on mute if you're using your keyboard. So that you should not just replace your capital stock, but you should do it in a way that makes you less vulnerable. And that's where the building back better comes from. So the building back better, and again, pardon me for thinking out loud, would be, in this case, building hospitals that have better a separation between units, for instance, so COVID doesn't spread in a hospital, or somehow a contaminated building it's tougher in this case. The typical case is if you rebuild a factory, you want to make it sturdier, or you want to put in modular construction, which makes its reconstruction, if there is a disaster, less costly. It's a little tougher in my framework to think of COVID in terms of building back better, because it's not a property damage related event. And possibly the building back better would make, even then, making people stronger and healthier helps, but and I guess people affected by COVID once then lead healthier lifestyles and then would be less vulnerable to a next bout of COVID or some other disease. That's probably the best example I can give you.
Sherman, did you want to ask something? I'm not clear what the question was, or whether you were just commenting.
I just commenting that I like the framework, and it is amazing. It's always been interesting to me that you can take this disaster model and carry it on into this analysis. It is a way of talking to the macro modelers. I just had a quick point, because we've been seeing studies of longer term impacts, and one of the terms of what he would call relocation is working for home is going to persist, which means you're going to have a declining demand for office space in downtown cities, which then has all kinds of spillover effects.
Right. So there are long-term effects there, and we'll just have to see. But we should be able to measure that within our model as a decrease in demand for office space, which will cause those prices to drop, and that gives you a little bit of a rebound effect there. But it's something that can be analyzed longer term, and I'm actually happy to see this because, and Sherman, you've gone through this in your life too. You get called to a meeting in DC, and maybe when you were living on the West Coast too, and you got to travel 3,000 miles back and forth to go to a 2-hour meeting. So now we've got a much better excuse to say, hey, I don't want to do that. I can do just as well on the computer screen, and I'm all for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's, I think, done all the questions. So I think it's been a good session. Lots of discussion and questions, which is great. So thank you very much for attending.
Okay, thank you, Terry, and thanks, Sherman, for suggesting I play a role in this. Maureen, good to see you again. I guess you tucked Peter in early today.
Yeah, well,
Could
that's right. He's doing his
Past his
bit Friday
bedtime?
night.
Is what? Sorry.
He's doing his stuff on Friday night.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. All right. And Alla, thank you too for helping out with this. And sorry I was so ham-fisted with WebEx. I'm pretty good at Zoom these days. Anyway, I think that's it, right?
Thank you.
I think so. Thank you.
I get to rush to the airport, take my first flight in 18 months. So,
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.